Welcome. Today we will discuss interest rates. In this lecture, we will discuss interest rate risk and how we can to measure interest rate risk according to repricing model, maturity model, and regression analysis. Also, we will discuss theories of term structure of interest rate risk. In beginning, what is interest rate risk? The interest rate risk, the risk of decline of interest income or interest revenue minus interest cost. That's associated with the movement in interest rates. Most of the loans and receivable of balance sheet for the banks and term or saving deposits generate revenues and costs. That's our interest rate driving. Measuring interest rate risk. We can to measure interest rate risk by repricing model, gap model, duration measurement, and regression analysis. In beginning, repricing model or gap model. This model based on book value contrasts with market value. That's based on maturity and duration model recommended by Bank for International Settlements. Repricing model based on rate sensitivity means time to repricing. Repricing gap is differences between rate sensitivity assets and rate sensitivity liabilities. RSA minus RSL. In commercial, bank must report repricing gaps for assets and liabilities with maturities of 1 day or 1 day to 3 months or more than 3 months to 6 months or more than 6 months to 1 year or more than 1 year to 5 years or over 5 years. Now, repricing gap or repricing model focus to find the gap between the assets and the liabilities. Example, if we have $20 million assets and $30 million liabilities, the gap will be $10 million. The difference is between the assets and the liabilities. Applying the repricing model for arrive net income interest. We need to arrive the change in net income interest. Example, in the 1 day bucket gap is minus 10 million. If the rates rise by 1%. For arrive to the change in net income interest by this equation, the gap, the differences between rate sensitivity assets and rate sensitivity liability, multiply the change in interest rate. In this example, the gap $10 million. The interest rate rise to 1%. Just we will multiply $10 million multiply 1% will equal $100,000. The change in net income interest rate. If we consider the cumulative 1 year gap, the gap $15 million. The differences between the assets and liabilities $15 million. The change in interest rate 1%. Just we will multiply $15 million multiply 1% will equal $150,000. The change in net income interest. rate sensitive assets. Example for hypothetical balance sheet. In short term consumer loans, if repriced at year end, would just make 1 year cutoff, while rate sensitive liabilities backed in same manner as rate sensitive assets. That's demand deposits and bus book saving account warrant special minutes. Now gap ratio may be useful to express gap ratio from gap on assets or liability. This ratio will provide direction of exposure, scope of exposure. Example, if we have the gap, the differences between assets and liability, $15 million, and we have assets $270 million. Now, if we need to arrive to gap ratio, we will divide $15 million divide $270 million. The ratio will be 5.6. This ratio is important to provide direction of exposure and as scope of exposure. Now, the change between the assets and the liability may be the equal rate change, maybe or unequal rate change. In the first case, equal rate change on rate sensitive asset and rate sensitive liabilities. Example, if we suppose rates rise 2% for rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities. Now we need to arrive to the change in net income interest. We suppose the change in interest rate equal for rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities. If we suppose we have gap $15 million, we need to arrive to net income interest rate. Just we will multiply the gap $15 million multiply the change in interest rate to 1% will equal $150,000. Now in this case, with positive gap rates and net income interest move in same direction because same interest rates. Now in the second case, unequal change in rates. If change in rates on rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities are not same, are not equal, the spread change in this case, example, rate sensitive assets rise by 1.2%, while rate sensitive liability rises by 1%. Now we need to calculate the change in net income interest rate will equal the change in interest revenue minus the change in interest expenses. We will multiply the change revenue $150 million multiply 1.2, the change in interest rate for rate sensitive assets minus the change in interest expenses will equal $310,000. Restructuring assets and liabilities. Restructure assets and liability on or off balance sheet to benefit whether positive gap or negative gap. Positive gap, increase in rates, increase in net income interest. Or negative gap, decrease in rates, increase in net income interest rate. Main weaknesses of repricing model. Repricing model focused on book value. For that, ignore market value effective of interest rate changes. Also, distribution of assets and liability within individual bucket is not considered. Also, ignore effects of run-offs. Runs-off may be rate very sensitive. Also, off-balance sheet items are not included. Example, hedging effects of balance sheet items not captured. Example, future contracts. This repricing model. Also, we can to measure the risk according to the maturity model. Explicitly incorporates market value effects for fixed income assets and liability. In this case, rise/fall in interest rates will contribute to rise in market price. And the longer maturity will affect to high effect on interest rate that will change on market price. Also, fall in value of longer term securities increases at diminishing rates for given increase in interest rate. Maturity of portfolio. Maturity of portfolio of assets or liabilities equal weighted average of maturities of individual components of the portfolio. Principle stated on previous slides apply to portfolio as well as to individual assets or liabilities. Typically, maturity gap, maturity assets minus maturity liabilities will be larger than 0 for most banks and firms. Effects of interest rate changes. Size of gap determines the size of interest rates change. That will drive net worth to 0. Leverage also affects ability to eliminate interest rate risk by using maturity model. Example, if we have assets $100 million in 1 year with 10%, founded with 90 million in 1 year with 10% deposits and equity. Now the maturity gap is 0, but the exposure to interest rate risk is not 0. Duration. Now, duration refers to the average life of an asset or liability. The average life for an asset or liability, the weighted average time to maturity using present value of the cash flow. That's related to total present value of the assets or liability as weights. Unbiased execution theories. Now we will discuss the main theories of structure of interest rate risk. The first, unbiased execution theory. This theory refers to yield curve reflected market expectation of the future short-term rates. And long-term rates are geometric average of current and expected short-term rates. Second theory, liquidity premium. Liquidity premium allows for future uncertainty. Also focus on premium required to hold long term. Liquidity premium theory focus on allows for future uncertainty. Also, there's market segmentation theory. Market segmentation theory refers the investors have specific needs in terms of maturity. The yield curve reflects an intersection of demand and supply of individual maturities. Regression analysis. Also, we can measure interest rate risk by regression analysis. That's based to estimate the historical relationship between interest rates and bank performance. The interest rate coefficient may be to be positive coefficient that suggested past performance of positively affected on interest rate risk, or maybe to be negative coefficient. Now, for measuring the interest rate risk, we have three methods. Repricing model, that's based on book value. Maturity model, based on market value and duration. Also, we can measure the risk by regression analysis. Now, we will discuss some methods for reducing interest rate risk. How we can reduce interest rate risk? We can reduce the interest rate risk by using interest rate future contract. We can reduce the interest rate risk by using future contracts, as future contracts, hedging contracts. Also, we can using interest rates swaps by arrangement to exchange periodic cash flow based on specific interest rates. Also, we can reduce the interest rate risk by using interest rates caps. Now finish this lecture. See you in next lecture. Thank you.